Autumn evening, 1984. Royal Opera House, London. Massive chandeliers cast light on diamond necklaces and metal-covered tailcoats. That night, a man entering through the door cut through the silver silence like a knife. Freddie Mercury wasn't wearing a costume, he was wearing a dream. His tailcoat from Savile Row was a masterpiece of craftsmanship. White waistcoat pristine, hair swept back meticulously. He'd come not as a rock star, but as an opera lover, drawn by his admiration for Montserrat Caballé and respect for classical music's vast depth. But the moment Freddie stepped inside, the salon's warm atmosphere turned to ice. Eyes turned to him, but not with admiration. This was the look given to an uninvited guest, a foreigner contaminating their purity. As Freddie moved toward the salon's center with his glass, the whispers rising behind him were clearer than the orchestra's tuning. "Look at that," said a duchess with pearl necklace behind her fan. "What's a Zanzibari dentist's son doing at our opera evening? Especially in that showman form of his." What happened next when an emergency arose and Freddie sat at the piano to accompany an aging soprano, then joined with his own voice would teach British aristocracy a lesson they'd never forget about what true nobility means. This is the story of the night Freddie Mercury demolished a velvet barrier with a song. The autumn of 1984 in London was a time when class divisions remained rigid, when social boundaries were enforced through subtle exclusions and carefully maintained hierarchies. The Royal Opera House in Covent Garden was the temple of this hierarchy, a place where Britain's aristocracy gathered to celebrate not just music, but their own continued relevance, their inherited right to occupy the best seats, the finest boxes, the most privileged positions in society. Tonight's gala was particularly exclusive. The cream of British society had turned out in formal evening wear that cost more than most people earned in a year. Duchesses dripped with family jewels that had passed through generations. Retired military officers wore dress uniforms heavy with medals from conflicts most attendees couldn't name. Wealthy industrialists who'd bought their way into acceptance stood alongside aristocrats who'd never questioned their right to be there. This was old money's fortress, and they protected it jealously. Freddie Mercury was 38 years old, at the height of Queen's commercial success. Radio Gaga had been a massive hit earlier that year. Queen's performance at Live Aid the following summer would be considered one of the greatest in rock history. But tonight, Freddie wasn't here as a rock star. He was here as a music lover, drawn by genuine passion for opera, for classical vocal technique, for the art form he'd studied and admired since childhood. His appearance was impeccable. The tailcoat from Savile Row, London's most prestigious tailoring street, was perfectly cut, showing he understood the dress code and could afford the finest. His thick, dark mustache was perfectly groomed, his short hair swept back with precision. White waistcoat, black bow tie, patent leather shoes, every detail was correct, traditional, appropriate. He looked in every visible way like he belonged. But the moment he entered the Royal Opera House's grand salon for the pre-performance reception, the atmosphere shifted. Conversations didn't stop that would have been too obvious, too crude, but they shifted. Eyes moved toward him with that particular quality of aristocratic assessment, measuring, judging, finding wanting. The whispers began almost immediately. A duchess in her 70s, dripping with pearls that had been in her family for generations, spoke to her companion behind a delicate fan. "Look at that. What is a Zanzibari dentist's son doing at our opera evening? A pop singer, no less." And in that theatrical way of his, the whispers spread like ripples in water, each circle carrying the message. Outsider, inappropriate, not one of us. A retired general, his chest heavy with medals, sipped his whiskey and laughed quietly with his group. The tailcoat is a size too large for him. Breeding cannot be purchased, only inherited. This isn't one of his stadiums. Here, only those with proper surnames speak. An industrialist who'd made his fortune in shipping sneered to his wife. Heathrow baggage handler playing dress-up. Money can buy Savile Row, but it can't buy centuries of lineage. Freddie heard these whispers, every single one. He'd been hearing variations of them since he arrived in England as a teenage refugee from Zanzibar. Since his days carrying luggage at Heathrow to earn money, since he'd changed his name from Farouk Bulsara to Freddie Mercury, trying to fit into a country that would never fully accept him as British. But tonight hurt differently. Tonight he'd come with pure intentions not to perform, not to be noticed, just to appreciate the art form he genuinely loved. And they were reminding him, in their subtle, aristocratic way, that he didn't belong. He could feel the invisible barrier forming around him. People shifted their bodies slightly to exclude him from their circles. Conversations that might have welcomed a stranger closed at his approach. He was being frozen out with that particular British skill of making exclusion seem accidental rather than deliberate. Freddie stood alone in the middle of the grand salon, surrounded by hundreds of people, completely isolated. He felt something rising in his chest, that old familiar feeling of being Farouk again, the foreign kid who didn't quite fit, the immigrant boy with the prominent teeth and the strange name. He took the hand of that shy childhood self inside him and lifted his chin higher. If they wanted to see a foreigner, an outsider, someone who didn't belong, he would show them what grace under pressure actually looked like. The performance itself was magnificent. Freddie sat in his purchased seat, not in the aristocratic boxes, but in the stalls, among those who'd bought rather than inherited their positions, and lost himself in the music. This was what he'd come for. The soaring voices, the orchestral power, the technical perfection combined with emotional depth. This was music that transcended class and nationality and all the petty boundaries humans erected between each other. For 2 hours, he forgot about the whispers and just listened. The reception afterward was worse. The aristocratic freeze-out became more pronounced. Freddie stood near the champagne table, and people literally turned their backs to him, creating a physical barrier with their bodies. The duchess who'd first commented was holding court nearby, her voice pitched just loud enough for Freddie to hear. One simply doesn't understand what the organizers were thinking, allowing just anyone to purchase tickets. There used to be standards. A younger woman, probably the duchess's granddaughter, looked uncomfortable. "Grandmother, he's Freddie Mercury, from Queen. They're quite famous." "Precisely," the duchess said with aristocratic disdain. "Famous, not distinguished, not one of us." Freddie's hands tightened on his champagne glass. Every instinct told him to leave, to escape this hostile environment, to return to spaces where he was celebrated rather than tolerated. But then something unexpected happened. An announcement rippled through the salon. The evening's guest of honor, an aging soprano who'd been one of Britain's greatest voices, wished to perform a farewell aria. She would sing at the salon's grand piano as a gift to the assembled guests. There was polite applause. The soprano, elegant in her 70s, a genuine artist respected by all, moved toward the piano with the assistance of a younger colleague. But then came the problem. The pianist who was supposed to accompany her wasn't in the salon. He'd stepped out, wasn't immediately available. A small panic rippled through the organizers. The soprano stood by the piano waiting, while people scurried to find the missing accompanist. The aristocratic crowd shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. There was supposed to be seamless perfection, not this awkward scrambling. And in that moment, Freddie Mercury made a decision. He set down his champagne glass and moved through the crowd toward the piano. No announcement, no asking permission, just quiet, dignified movement toward a need that required filling. "Is he really going to play? A pop singer?" someone hissed. Freddie didn't hear or chose not to. He reached the piano, where the soprano looked at him with surprise, but also recognition. She knew who he was, knew his reputation as a musician, not just a rock star. He nodded respectfully to her, slowly removed his white gloves, a gesture both practical and symbolic, adjusted his tailcoat, and placed his hands on the ivory keys. The salon went absolutely silent. For a moment, no one breathed. The Zanzibari dentist's son was about to accompany one of Britain's greatest sopranos. The pop singer was about to attempt classical music in front of the most judgmental audience imaginable. And then Freddie began to play. The first notes poured from the piano, and the whispers stopped instantly. This wasn't competent amateur playing. This was mastery. Freddie wasn't just hitting the correct keys, he was making the piano speak. creating a foundation of such beauty that the soprano's eyes widened with genuine appreciation. He knew this music, had studied it, loved it, and now he was sharing that love with people who'd spent the entire evening trying to make him feel small. A few moments into the piece, Freddie did something completely unexpected. While continuing to play the piano accompaniment with his left hand and portions of his right, he began to sing, adding his own distinctive tenor voice to support and harmonize with the soprano's aging but still powerful instrument. It was audacious. It was presumptuous by aristocratic standards. It was also absolutely devastatingly beautiful. His voice, that four-octave range that had filled stadiums, was being employed here with classical technique and restraint, supporting rather than overwhelming, harmonizing rather than competing. He was demonstrating that he understood this music not as an outsider mimicking the forms, but as someone who genuinely comprehended the art. The aria built and soared. Freddie's piano playing was exquisite, his vocal harmonies perfectly judged. The soprano, initially surprised, began to smile as she sang, finding joy in this unexpected collaboration, in this pop singer who turned out to understand her art form as well as any classical musician. When the final note faded, the Royal Opera House salon fell into profound, shaking silence. No one applauded. They couldn't, because the man they'd called a dentist's son, the foreigner, the pop singer who didn't belong, he'd just shown them a nobility they'd never possessed despite their titles and lineage. The duchess, who'd first mocked him, stood frozen, her champagne glass trembling in her hand. Tears were visible on her weathered aristocratic face, tears she couldn't control, provoked by beauty that transcended all her prejudices. The retired general who'd sneered about breeding stood with his head bowed, unable to meet anyone's eyes. The industrialist who'd mentioned Heathrow baggage handling stared at the floor, ashamed. They'd spent the evening trying to make Freddie feel inferior, and he'd responded not with anger or confrontation, but with art so profound that it revealed their own spiritual poverty. Freddie slowly stood from the piano bench, replaced his white gloves with careful precision, adjusted his tailcoat, and as he turned to leave the piano, he made eye contact with the general who'd insulted him. The general, a man who'd commanded troops, who'd never bowed to anyone, slowly lowered his head in acknowledgement of a superior force. Freddie merely smiled slightly, said nothing. No triumph, no gloating, no confrontation. His answer had been given through music. The soprano approached him, took both his hands, and said loud enough for those nearby to hear, "Thank you, that was extraordinary. You have a gift that transcends all boundaries." The emphasis on all boundaries was deliberate. She was telling the assembled aristocracy that his art mattered more than their bloodlines. Freddie bowed to her with genuine respect, then quietly made his way toward the exit. As he collected his coat and prepared to leave, Mary Austin appeared beside him. She'd been waiting in a separate area, not part of the formal gala, and had heard from staff about what happened. "I heard what they said about you, Freddie," Mary said, her voice shaking with protective anger. "They were so cruel." The car pulled away from Covent Garden, and the lights of the Royal Opera House receded behind them. But Freddie wasn't watching the building disappear. He was staring at his hands, those same hands that had just silenced a room full of aristocrats who'd spent the entire evening trying to make him feel invisible. Mary sat beside him in the darkness, her own hands trembling with residual anger. The silence stretched between them until she couldn't contain it anymore. "Freddie," she said, her voice shaking, "I heard what they said. Every cruel word. That duchess calling you a dentist's son. That general saying breeding can't be purchased. They treated you like you were nothing. And you just sat at that piano and played for them. Why didn't you say anything? Why didn't you confront them?" Freddie continued looking at his hands for a long moment. Then slowly he raised his eyes to meet hers. That familiar mischievous glint was there, but beneath it was something forged in fire, something earned through decades of being told he didn't belong. "Mary, darling," he said quietly, "let me tell you something about winning." He shifted in his seat, and suddenly he wasn't exhausted anymore. He was animated, alive, that performer's energy returning. "There are two ways to defeat people who believe they're inherently superior to you. The first way, the way they expect, is to argue, to prove you deserve a seat at their table, to beg for validation from people who've decided you're beneath them. He paused, his voice dropping to that distinctive tone that could fill stadiums without amplification. But that's playing their game by their rules. And their rules are designed so you can never truly win. Because even if you prove you belong, you've still accepted that they had the right to judge you in the first place. Mary leaned forward, captivated. So what's the second way? Freddie's smile widened, and for a moment he looked exactly like the man who commanded Wembley Stadium. The second way, my dear, is to show them that their entire world, their titles, their lineage, their carefully guarded fortress of inherited privilege is too small to contain what you are. You don't break down their door begging to be let in. You build something so magnificent that their fortress becomes a prison they've locked themselves into. He turned to look back at the opera house, now just a distant glow against London's night sky. That duchess with her pearl necklace, do you know what she's doing right now? She's lying in her bed in whatever ancestral estate her family's owned it for centuries. And she's hearing that aria in her head. Every time she closes her eyes tonight, she'll see the Zanzibari dentist's son at that piano. She'll remember how his voice made her cry despite herself. His voice grew more intense, more passionate. And tomorrow morning, when she wakes up surrounded by portraits of ancestors who won their titles through violence centuries ago, she'll realize something devastating. That all her inherited privilege, all her bloodline, none of it could create what I created tonight with 10 minutes at a piano. Mary was silent, understanding dawning. I gave her something her money can't buy, Mary, something her title can't grant. I gave her beauty, truth, a moment of transcendence. And the cruel irony is that it came from exactly the person she spent all evening trying to diminish. Freddie looked down at his hands again, and his voice became softer, more reflective. I didn't go there to join their world. I went because I love opera. But when they tried to make me feel like an intruder, I realized something important. I don't want to belong to their world. Their world is dying, Mary. Yao Iron. It's a museum of inherited privilege slowly becoming irrelevant. But music, real music, that's eternal. He turned to face her fully now, his eyes blazing with conviction. Music doesn't care if you were born in Buckingham Palace or Zanzibar. It doesn't care if your great-great-grandfather was a duke or a baggage handler. It only cares about one thing, truth. Can you create beauty from nothing but air and vibration and the courage to be vulnerable? The car turned onto his street, approaching Garden Lodge. Tonight they wanted to see a foreigner, an outsider, a pop singer pretending to understand their refined classical world. Instead, they saw something that terrified them. They saw someone who understood their world better than they did, who could speak its language more fluently, who could create beauty they could only consume. He smiled that devastating smile, the one that had conquered stadiums, and now, quietly, had demolished something far more fortified than any arena. They wanted to remind me of my place, so I showed them that my place is wherever I choose to stand. And tonight I chose to stand at that piano and demonstrate that a refugee with passion has more nobility in his fingertips than they have in their entire lineage. Mary's eyes were wet now. They'll remember this night forever, won't they? Oh yes, Freddie said as the car stopped, but not for the reasons they expected. They came to feel superior. Instead, they learned that the barriers they've spent centuries building to keep people out are actually walls that keep them trapped inside. He opened the car door, stepping out into the cool London night. Let them keep their velvet barriers. I'll keep my music. And in 100 years, no one will remember their names, but they'll still be singing mine.